Boys, I come to you with one of the greatest decks of all time, Zoodiac. This is without a doubt the absolute best, not only for the upcoming XYZ Fest, which is actually live right now, but also for the actual metagame and entirety of Master Duel. If you want a consistently powerful deck to play, which is able to grind and absolutely choke the life out of your opponents, pick up this deck. I'm going to give you guys a brief history, a card by card discussion, and of course a replay in order for you guys to grasp and understand what this deck is capable of. So let's just jump straight into it. Zoodiac is without a doubt the best archetype and arguably the best deck in the entire history of Yu-Gi-Oh! And yes, that's even including Tier 0 formats like Teledad and the 2 minutes of Armageddon Dragon Yadalock. With it being released in Raging Tempest and even more powerful support backing it up in Maximum Crisis, this led to, well, a Maximum Crisis for the entire game. Zoodiac was all that was worth playing, and everyone was out either to play it or beat it. Historically, you'll see terrible techs in deck lists, such as My Body as a Shield, in order to counteract cards like Trident, but it was never truly enough. Zoodiac was a definitive Tier 0 deck for years, and when Master Duel 4 was announced, Konami kind of hoped that this plus a couple of limits and gentle hits would be enough, but turns out that Trident Pass was honestly the ultimate end goal of Yu-Gi-Oh! Until Konami ultimately banned Broad Bull, their Omni Searcher, Trident, a Regaki Break on Legs, and a bunch of other supplementary cards such as Rat Pier and MX Saber Invoker. However, since we live in the fantasy land that is Master Duel, we are able to play this archetype once again due to Trident being limited in this game, which in reality is all this deck really needs to be able to play as a control shell, and the actual reason why this deck is so good. Divine Arsenal AA Zeus, which is one of the greatest pieces of Zoodiac support without being even named after one, because you are able to summon it off of Broad Bull, who's able to attack directly, and you are able to make a 4-material Zeus at the drop of a hat. With room for techs and hand traps, an incredibly tight and powerful engine, and incredible payoffs going both first and second, we are able to grind like no other deck before us and absolutely stomp our opponents into the dust with our furry friends. So, let's get into the card by card. Note that this list was entirely stolen from Herman Hansen's Twitter, so if you have someone to complain to, blame him, not me. We're playing 3 Zoodiac Thoroughblade, who is our cycler. You are usually going to be pitching something like Ram because we're not playing combo. Combo was only really played when you had Rat Pier to dump off of it, but because Rat Pier is banned, we're not playing it. Ram has some pretty good applications against stuff like Eldritch most specifically, but also stuff like Phantom Knights and the Fog Blade, as well as some of the Trap Tricks trap holes that do target. Just an overall pretty neat card. And Zoodiac Whiptail, which is not only a normal summon, but an incredibly powerful battle trap at times. Stuff like Eldritch trying to crash into a Thoroughbladed Trident, you could just Whiptail, banish the Eldritch, and keep your Trident alive, which is super neat. Note, however, that the banish is mandatory, so if you know your opponent has a strike or you want to play against cards that might have banish synergy, stuff like the Numeron Sanya card, just keep that in mind. And we're playing 1 Bunny Blast. This kind of doesn't have as many applications as something like Ram does, but Bunny Blast does have some pretty neat overall applications when you're playing against something like Striker. But however, Bunny Blast probably the worst one in my opinion. For the hand trap lineup, we're playing 3 DD Crow because this deck has a lot of space for hand traps, and DD Crow is incredibly powerful, being able to hit stuff like Eldritch as well as Drytron, but also has a ton of other hits as well. You could do stuff like banish targets off of the Tri-Brigade, Foolish Barrel, the Fractal. You could banish something like a Cobalt Sparrow, which a Lyra Lusk Turquoise Warbler is trying to revive. A lot of neat stuff off of that. 3 Veiler, this should be Infinite Impermanence, but I don't own Imperm. 3 Maxi because this card is broken. 3 Ash Blossom because this card is also broken and stops Maxi. 3 Skullmeister because this card not only has applications, of course, against Eldritch and Drytron, but also does have a lot more incidental synergy in disrupting opponents' play. Stuff like Adamancipator's Block Dragon in the graveyard is really nice to hit if they aren't able to get the Appaloosa off. Stuff like Prank Kids trying to summon is also really free Skullmeister bait. It's also not a once per turn, and it's also a level 4, so if you ever need to make Broad Bull, overlay 2 of these guys, I guess. And 2 Nibiru. You could obviously just play 1. 2 is the sort of absolute maximum you should be playing because of bricking and math and blah 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 blah. But basically, if you want to cut a card, I'd probably choose either the Bunny Blast or the Nibiru or both. Why not? For consistency, we're playing 3 Fire Formation Tenki because this shit searches any Zoodiac and is absolutely broken. 3 Potted Desires. This does cut into your grind game a little bit, being that you are banishing 10 cards. But thanks to Pot of Avarice, as long as you're not banishing both of those, you should be absolutely fine. This card is insane. You're able to recycle stuff in your extra deck that's limited. Stuff like the Trident, the Draco Future, the Zeus, as well as additional names you may need to draw into. Even hand traps if you aren't really fiending for additional names. This card is absolutely incredible, being able to fill up your graveyard at the drop of a hat with cards like Zeus and Trident detaching all the time. Absolutely incredible card in this deck specifically. We're playing 1 monster reborn because guess what? The normal summon deck is super reliant on its normal summon. Kinda oopsie. That's not good. Anyways, 2 Called by the Grave, which is sort of just to stop hand traps, and because this card is also very broken, and 2's Cosmic Cyclone. Usually you're not going to be too worried about back row because Trident and Zeus usually handled those matchups really well. This is sort of just for stuff like dumb floodgates like Skill Drain, there can be only one, etc, etc, etc. Now, onto the extra deck. We're playing 1 Utopic Future and 1 Utopic Draco Future. Note that the Utopic Future can be made with 2 Zoodiacs, but of course remember that the monster Chalconine brings back cannot be used as XYZ material, not just for Zoodiacs, but of course for Utopic Future. So just keep that in mind in future games. Speaking of, we're playing 3 Zoodiac Tiger Motor, who is our material attacher, and our Zoodiac Chalconine. Usually you're going to be using Chalconine to sort of bring back a monster, usually a Trident on like turn 3 and 4, and you're going to be using Tiger Mortar to attach a material underneath it so that for turn 4 or 5, you're able to have a Trident refreshed for the next turn if in case they outed it the first time. Speaking of, we're playing 1 Zoodiac Trident. Ideally, we'd play 3, but it's at 1. Tough shit. Zoodiac Borbo is our direct attacker and our line to Zeus. Nothing much to really say about that. And 2 Zoodiac Hammer Kong. This one sucks. This one should ideally be Broad Bull because it could get us a search, but we're usually just using Hammer Kong as the free detach. So we don't have to detach our main deck Zoodiac and just bring our monster back to 0. So usually you're going to be going like normal summon like a Thoroughblade into a Hammer Kong into a Trident, so that you're usually just detaching the Hammer Kong for the effect. You're never really going to be sitting on this as like Kong Trident pass. That just doesn't happen anymore. Anyways, 1 Drill Driver Vespinato. This card has applications because obviously you could just use one of your Zoodiacs in order to climb into this. It has like a big booty and very simplified game states, as well as being able to revive. The piercing effect also comes up as well, surprisingly, somehow. This game is weird. And of course, 1 Divine Arsenal Double A Zeus. Broken. Board wipe. You can put like 500 materials under it. You could easily make a 4 material Zeus, and if you really want to play into that Maxi or Nibiru, you can make a 6 material Zeus. Absolutely incredible card for cleaning up board states and putting the offensive pressure on your opponent. So, let's hop into a game. So, our match is against Trap Tricks, and this is a pretty good matchup with a pretty good hand. We've opened something like Thoroughblade, we've opened Call by the Grave and Effect Filler for Disruption, and of course we've opened an additional name to discard as well as a way to get to Whiptail. So, of course, let's just get straight into the news. We're going to use Tenki, try and bait out like an Ash Blossom. We're going to be able to grab our Whiptail, and we're going to normal summon our Thoroughblade, pitch the Ram because we don't really need it, and grab a Maxi! This is one of the incredible parts about Zoodiac. You're able to very easily find disruption off of stuff like Desires, Thoroughblade draws, etc. We're going to rank up into Hammer Kong, and of course we're going to immediately rank up into Trident. The Hammer Kong is of course just being our material for detach. We're going to set our Call by the Grave and pass it over to our opponent. This may not look like a lot, but our opponent is pretty confident that we have a Whiptail and at least 1 disruption in hand. They're going to go for their Murmillo. We're not really too scared of it because all we have to do is really keep them off Sarah, and then we could just sort of beat them to death with Trident and Zeus. They're going to add the time-space trap hole after we pop the Murmillo. They're going to set the Shade Brigandine and activate it. We're going to chain Maxi because we're basically never going to get a chance to use this card. And after summoning their Shade Brigandine, we're going to draw Nibiru. This card is very dead. They're going to go for the Arlecchino in hand, who is going to special summon itself for free. And this is where Whiptail really does have an incredible application in being able to deal with big bodies. One of Zoodiac's main issues is kind of sometimes you just lose to like any monster with over 1600 attack, and Whiptail really does ensure and protect you against that. So we're going to draw another Whiptail. They're going to set to, they're going to go to battle phase. On attack declaration, we're going to equip our Trident. That's going to pump it up to 2900. That's going to not only kill the Arlecchino, but banish it as well. Our opponent, seeing the writing on the wall and super duper scared of Zeus, concedes. So let's talk about the pros and cons. 1. This deck is so consistent. I don't think I really have to explain why a deck with 12 one-card normal summon starters is consistent, as well as having, you know, access to cards like Tenki, Desires, and Avarice. But holy shit, this deck is just, if you can find a normal summon, you've basically won the game. 2. This deck has a ton of hidden disruption. Being able to play like a million hand traps means that your opponent has to kind of play beyond just knowing that there is a Trident. They have to really formulate, okay, what if they have an Ash Blossom? What if they have a Valor? What if they might not have anything at all and I'm overthinking things? Your opponent having to really focus in on what sort of lines they have to take, as well as Zoodiac being able to consistently open 2 to 3 hand traps every single hand, or even more depending on how well you draw, is absolutely insane and incredible. Like, holy shit, it's broken. And 3, Pot of Avarice is really nice. Pot of Avarice is sort of this like weird gimmick card that unfortunately in the modern metagame doesn't really get a ton of use just because of how situational it is. But in a deck like Zoodiac, in a deck where you're trying to control and outgrind your opponent, this card is absolutely amazing, especially when you're able to Avarice into Avarice, or Avarice into Desires, or Avarice into like 2 hand traps, and basically your opponent will sit there crying and shitting their pants. And let's get into the cons. 1, this deck has no plays beyond its normal summon. If it gets popped by something like Torrential, or like your XYZ summon gets striked, you're kind of fucked. This is an incredibly difficult scenario for the deck to really push itself beyond something like Reborn, and is really just a balancing act of how many defensive cards you want to play if you do get stopped, stuff like Torrential, Solemns, versus stuff that is very reactive to your opponent's plays that are much better when you have an established board, stuff like Ash Blossom, stuff like Valor, hand traps that are more powerful on a board that is backed up by a Trident versus a very empty board. And that sort of balancing act is what you have to ask yourself when you're building this deck. 2, this deck is hard. Not hard in the sense of where like normal summon Ram overlay into Hammer Kong overlay into Trident Pass is like technically difficult, but difficult in the sense of, you know, actual technical play. Where am I going to use this hand trap? Where am I going to, you know, negate my opponent's plays? Should I search a Whiptail or should I go for a high roll Thoroughblade play? Obviously, these are all questions that are always solved throughout just like understanding the metagame and like hours and hours of practice. But again, there are going to be minute scenarios where you might miss an OTK line, or you might miss a line where you're able to end on like maybe a negate and a Trident because maybe you overlooked something and you sort of like tunneled in on sort of just getting damage onto the board. And of course, this is something that of course does come with practice and time. And 3, this deck is kind of low ceiling. It's hard to explain because Trident plus 3 hand traps is kind of like broken, but your opponent does have time to out your board if you aren't able to grab a ton of defensive cards. Your opponent is probably not going to be able to play through the turn 2 of getting like Tridented plus like double hand trapped, but if you're not drawing anything else, you're kind of sitting on just like a Trident or like a 2 material Zeus, or maybe a 4 material Zeus that's going to get dropleted in the future. So obviously keep that in mind, where sometimes you're just going to be able to have one explosive turn and then you realize, oh shit, I'm sitting on a Trident, nothing else. And obviously, of course, that can be remedied with cards like more consistency, like more Avarices, blah 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 blah. But of course, that is a question that comes into deck building. Overall, I think this deck is absolutely incredible. This deck is historically and always has been really fucking broken, and I cannot wait to never touch this deck again. Holy shit, it's just normal summoning, bro. All I'm gonna say is I've been Stevie Blunder. Thanks for watching my videos, and yeah, it's gonna be it for today. See ya.